Hey there, and welcome back to Just Ask Jason, your bi-weekly devotional here at Berean. Today, we are asking, did Noah's flood actually happen? Depending on which way you lean, then that's an obvious question, because a lot of people will say, yeah, of course it happened, Bible said it must have happened. And then a bunch of people will say, no, of course it didn't happen, that story is ridiculous. The thing is, Christendom is usually a lot bigger than our own opinions. So today we're going to look through three different views that are all views held by Jesus-following Christians. We're going to look at them a little bit, examine them a little bit, basically say why people believe different things. And at the end of the video, then we're going to pull out some devotional value from this little bit of exercise that hopefully help you be closer to Jesus, because ultimately that's the goal anyway. So let's get started. The first view that we want to explain is the conservative or traditional view, the view that Noah's flood literally happened and was on a global scale, and the only animals, anyways, that survived were those that were conserved on the ark. Evidence for this theory, it goes something like this, or the arguments for this theory go something like this. First of all, that fossils, including fossil fuels, are actually a reflection of the massive die-off in the flood era, not of millions of years of deposition of fossils. Second of all, that yes, Noah would have been able to do the things described, such as build a giant boat that conserved all animal life, because he wouldn't have actually had that many animals with him. For example, instead of bringing 4 different species of dog, like a wolf and a coyote and a domesticated dog and a dingo, he would have only brought one of those 4 kinds, maybe a wolf, and then all modern dogs would be descended from that one pair. That's based on the Hebrew word min, which means kind, but is normally translated species. Flood legends are another big piece of support in this argument. The idea in the view of traditionalists, although we'll see moderates introduce a different idea in a moment, but flood legends are actually seen as a cultural memory of this massive worldwide flood event. Basically, the theory or the story would go something like this. Noah and his family survived the flood, and therefore all people on earth are descended from him. So different cultural groups are really different families that are descended from the same common ancestor, Noah and his family. Each of these families would have had stories passed down to them about the flood narrative, and over time those stories are tweaked and changed by each individual culture group, but the true story is preserved in Genesis. That's how traditionalists or conservatives would characterize the rise of different flood narratives. And so flood legends or flood narratives are actually seen as support for this form, or for this view. Broadly speaking, proponents of this view are not going to trust modern carbon dating methods. They're going to assert that because of the cosmic scale of the flood and different conditions in the way that the environment functioned pre-flood versus post-flood, that carbon dating is not accurate past 4,000 or 5,000 years. So carbon dating that comes back saying that something is 40,000 years old, for example, is not going to be believed. This ties into the fossil argument mentioned earlier. So in a nutshell, that's the conservative or the traditional view of Noah's flood. The second theory that we have to deal with is what I'm terming moderate view, the view that Noah's flood was literal, but it wasn't worldwide, it was only over a specific region. This hinges on the claim that world, or the word translated in English as world, in ancient context would have been more akin to the phrase continent or even region. The term in question here is a Hebrew word eretz, which literally just means dirt. And it's used metaphorically to refer to countries, to regions, to even the entirety of the globe. And it's very difficult to tell exactly what's being meant here. In addition to that, the proponents of this theory will argue that ancient people, including biblical authors, often used hyperbole. So when we see phrases like the tallest mountain was covered in water, then the expression isn't meant to literally convey that every mountain on the face of the earth was covered with water because the flood was just so massive. The point being conveyed is just there's a lot of water, and maybe even that the person in the middle of the flood couldn't see any mountains in any direction, which certainly would be possible with a very large flood in some of those regions. Scientific arguments used to support this broadly fall into 2 categories, either around the area of the Euphrates or around the area of the Black Sea. Supporting the idea that this flood happened around the Black Sea is the work of a underwater archaeologist named Robert Ballard, who is actually famous for finding the Titanic in 1985. But he's also done work in the Black Sea region where he found entire villages and towns underwater in the Black Sea region, and he came up with a theory that melting ice caps after the last ice age about 5,000 years ago would have actually brought so much water into the Mediterranean area that eventually it overflowed and created the Black Sea and Bosphorus Straits as we know them today. It is possible, in Robert Ballard's view, that Noah's flood actually refers to this regional flood and not actually to a worldwide one. Additionally, other people theorize that the geography of the Euphrates region around the Euphrates River could have made a flood large enough to inspire Noah's story as well. In addition to all this, again, the flood narratives become relevant because you just don't get this many cultures in one area writing about a flood story unless they are inspired by some sort of common experience, or at least that's what the moderates will claim. The next view that we'll look at has a slightly different view of those ancient texts. But that is the moderate view in a nutshell. It is a regional flood, but still a literal one, and moderate Christians would hold that, well, God still caused those events. It was still miraculous, and it was still an act of judgment. We just shouldn't be looking for a worldwide flood. We should be looking for a regional act of judgment instead. The third and final view about Noah's flood is simply that there wasn't one. Proponents of this view will simply state that Noah's story was based off of older ancient Near Eastern documents like Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. Basically, flooding was a common thing in areas of Mesopotamia and often was very destructive when it wasn't expected. So people in the areas had to handle their trauma somehow and came up with these flood stories to make themselves feel better. Now, Christians who hold this view, which I'm loosely terming the liberal view, will assert that yes, this is still inspired scripture. Yes, God still wanted us to have it. We simply shouldn't understand it as history. We should only understand it for its devotional value. So that's going to be broadly the liberal view, that Noah's story is not based on a real person or a real flood, but rather is based off of older stories, and nothing resembling Noah's flood ever actually historically happened. You'll see skeptics take this side, but you'll also see Christians take this side as well. And when they do, they'll simply say this is a devotional story and it shouldn't be read as history. So what should we walk away from this with? The first one, and I think the most important one, is that Jesus' kingdom is a lot bigger than my opinions. Jesus' kingdom is a lot bigger than your opinions too. There's a lot of room in Christianity for disagreement, including disagreement over things that many of us were raised to believe was very important. In the church that I was raised in, believing that there was a literal flood and a literal 7-day creation and that the earth was only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, were all seen as markers of being a real Christian. And if you disagreed with any of those things, there's kind of this unspoken opinion that, well, maybe you weren't a Christian, or maybe you weren't as good of a Christian as everyone else. And I think that is a view that's best left in the past. If you hold to a 7-day creation or to a 10,000-year-old earth or to a literal view of Noah's flood, those are legitimate ways of viewing the text. But if you don't, there's still room in Jesus' kingdom for you, because the one truth we're all united around is the historicity of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, not Noah's flood. The second thing we should walk away with is this text wasn't designed to answer your historical questions. Whether Noah was a real person or not, the text could very easily tell us. It could just say, hey guys, this literally happened, or hey guys, it didn't. It could give us more exact details about where the ark landed, or tell us exactly where Noah's grave is, or could have done any number of other things to help prove the historicity of this story. But it doesn't, and that should hint to you and to I that the original readers of this story didn't much care. Now, we can argue about whether or not they would have assumed it was historical, but the point is, this story was written to teach you and me about God. So, whether or not we believe Noah's story was literal, whether it was worldwide or regional or based off other texts, our first reading and our primary reading of this story should just be to figure out what is God telling me about himself. And then we can argue about historicity later. The third thing that we should walk away from this with is that knowledge like this is exceedingly helpful to categorize, not for the sake of being mean or ignoring people, but simply to know what you expect when you're interacting with certain Christian authors, publishers, or preachers. There are certain signals that you can look for, including someone's view of Noah's flood, of the creation, of the age of the earth, and things like that, that can help you put them broadly into philosophical camps. And this is helpful because, well, you should probably be listening to someone from every camp if you can. It's good to have someone that views Genesis 1 through 10 as mytho-history, as a particular teacher that I listen to quite often does. It's also good to have someone that believes that the earth is 10,000 years old and there's a literal 6-day creation and that Noah's flood actually happened, as several preachers that I follow do. Listening to those broad opinions can keep you from putting yourself in a box and remind you how big Jesus' kingdom is, which I think is a good in and of itself. It also keeps you from getting caught by surprise when you're listening to a sermon or reading a book and they make some sort of claim about Genesis or about the Old Testament or something. Often, if you know what philosophical camp they're in, then you'll expect those sort of things and you'll have a framework to fit it in. So this is a helpful exercise just to know how to categorize different people. Are they more conservative, more moderate, more liberal? Where do they fit on that scale? Also, just keep in mind, someone might have a very liberal view of Genesis and a very conservative view of the Gospels, so start fleshing out your view of different teachers the more that you experience, well, the things that they teach. So that's it. That's 3 views on the flood, and you'll notice that I didn't say what my view was, and, well, I intended not to. I don't want to sway you guys at all. I just wanted to use this as a little bit of a primer so that you know what to expect if you're ever reading about the early chapters of Genesis. Different views you'll run into even amongst Christians, and to drive home the point that we're all worshiping Jesus. Now, there's going to be a bonus video that's going to just look at the devotional value that can be found in the Noah's flood story. It's going to be a little bit shorter than this one. Just go over a few quick things that we can draw out of the text regardless of our view of it that kind of highlight who God is and things about his justice and righteousness. So go ahead and go on to that video if you got the time. If not, I'll see you back here next week.